non-believers would think I was being remiss if I didn't put a charge sheet against you for the crimes of Christianity over the last 2,000 years.
Christianity, in truth, is not only the world's most persecuted religion numerically, it's more persecuted than all other faiths put together.
For some people it is ideological, for some people religion is wrong, it is the enemy.
Chesterton said long ago, didn't he, when people give up on a faith like Christianity, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything.
We are producing a generation of people who I don't think have less of a longing for spiritual matters, but don't have a guide, don't have a map anymore.
I think it's unhistorical to claim that everything good we enjoy is due to Christianity. History is far messier, far more complex than that.
The real issue shadowing the whole of our conversation today is whether or not Christianity is true.
Hello and welcome back to the Unbelievable Podcast. I'm Roger Bolton, your host for today's discussion. And when mainstream churches are faltering and even at risk of dying out, we're going to ask, how can Christianity regain its confidence? And I'm delighted to welcome two guests. Nick Spencer, who is making a welcome return to the programme, and we'll be referencing his book, published some time ago, but very relevant today, The Evolution of the West, How Christianity Shaped Our Values. Nick is Senior Fellow at Theos, and is the author of several books, including Magisteria, The Entangled Histories of Science and Religion, Atheists, The Origin of the Species, and Nick is also the host of the podcast Reading Our Times. And he's joined by Rupert Shortt, a British author and journalist known for writing about the modern persecution of Christians around the world. And of course, he's the biographer of Rowan Williams. Rupert is a research associate at the University of Cambridge and was religion editor of the Times Literary Supplement from 2000 to 2020. And his latest book, just hot off the press, is The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. It's been described by historian Tom Holland as a brilliant survey of Christianity's decline in Britain. Well, gentlemen, I want to ask first of all why you felt impelled at the present time to write this book. And I know, Nick, you wrote yours a little while ago, but why do you think it's so relevant now? Why did you want to write it?
Well, I wrote mine about 10 years after the new atheists had their kind of entry onto the stage. And it seemed like an opportune moment then, because for a few years in the late noughties, people were energetically giving Christianity, specifically religion more generally, a big kicking and saying that it had contributed nothing meaningful and nothing positive to the modern world. By 2016, this big hoo-ha had died down a bit, and I thought it was an opportune moment to actually look back and put a bit of a corrective to that rather warlike and historically rather thin story.
Now, Rupert, I know you share some of those views, but you seem to me to be rather pessimistic about the future of Christianity. In fact, more than that, you call, the title of your book is The Eclipse of Christianity. Why did you want to write about it now?
The book actually pivots on a paradox, because in the world as a whole, Christianity is actually growing quite strongly. My focus is really on Britain and other parts of Western Europe, where the evidence of decline does seem pretty incontrovertible. On the other hand, eclipses by definition do come to an end. So I wouldn't want to make too strong a prediction for the future, but the statistics from censuses and what have you do nevertheless point to a steep decline in religious belief generally and particularly in Christianity in a country like the UK over the past 2 decades.
Well, Nick, let's start with you and this claim that Christianity is really central to contemporary civilization, and all the finest things, if you like, that we have are very much influenced by, if not caused by, Christian belief. For those people who are brought up in stories of the Crusades, anti-Semitism, authoritarian religion, misogyny, as they would see it, that's quite a claim. Why do you make it?
Well, I need to attenuate that slightly. I'm not going to claim, I don't claim, I think it's unhistorical to claim that everything good we enjoy is due to Christianity, and Christianity has only been the cause of good things in our society. History is far messier, far more complex than that. That would be fundamentally dishonest to say that. My claim is, if you like, a slightly less ambitious one. It is that vast number of the basic building blocks, you could call them, or commitments, or foundations of Western civilization. I'm going to put that in inverted commas because it's a contentious phrase and it's a complex phrase, but a large number of them can be traced back in some way to the influence of Christianity, partly its ideological influence, the way in which its ideas have permeated into the Western bloodstream, but also partly through its institutional intrusion into the Western world. It's basically its practical influence on Western social and political life. Those two things, institutional and ideological, are both very important for the way that Western society have evolved.
And you quote Samuel Moyn in your book, saying that the truth is that Europe and therefore the modern world drew nearly everything from Christianity in the long term. Without Christianity, our commitment to the moral equality of human beings is unlikely to have come about. And I was struck by actually a letter in the Times on Thursday, quoting Richard Dawkins, River Out of Eden, saying, "In a universe of blind physical forces, there is nothing but pitiless indifference. There is no justice, purpose, good or evil." Now, of course, I think that might shock even some who think they admire Richard Dawkins, but there will be people who say it's quite arrogant to suggest that these concepts of equality and human rights have a Christian origin. How can you make the case? Well, let's take specifically in terms of equality. In other words, not equality in terms of everybody being born with the same attributes, but everybody being equal in the sight of God.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've kind of answered your own question there, with those last three words you tagged on in the end, in the sight of God. What does equality actually mean? Look at us as a species and look at our basic physical or cognitive or psychological makeup for each of one. And in what sense are we all equal? Transparently, we're not. We all have fundamentally different abilities, different physiques, different cognitive powers, so on and so forth. It's a fundamental claim that many people hold, that human beings are morally or existentially of equal worth. Now, I think that's highly commendable, and I would defend it. But I cannot see, and I'm yet to read, a good argument for that absent a theistic worldview. In a world of blind, pitiless indifference, of no good, no evil, of random and chaotic material forces, the statement that humans, organisms that belong to this particular species, A, have a worth, and B, have an equal worth, that statement fundamentally doesn't make any sense in that blind, pitiless, materialistic universe. It does make sense, and I think it can be defended, in a universe which is in somehow marked with purpose and value and love, which is the universe of Christian theism.
If I could jump in, I think you have answered Dawkins's question yourself, Roger, in the way that you framed things. In another of his books, Dawkins says, in effect, there is nothing but DNA and we dance to its tune. Well, if that's right, then my goodness me, we're left with a lunar landscape, metaphysically speaking. Let's bracket the question of God for a moment. Meaning, value, morality. These things would appear to go out of the window. Now, as it happens, Dawkins, like many other atheists, has a strong sense of moral and ethical values. But I think the believer in God is entitled to come back and say, well, aren't they just arbitrary? If you are suggesting that ultimately the universe has no meaning or purpose or direction. And I think one of the claims that Nick and I are both making in different ways is that a theistic account of all dimensions of human experience in the round makes more sense. It makes more sense of the data of our experience.
I mean, you have an unlikely supporter in a way. Again, Nick, it's in your book when you refer to John Gray, whom you call a disarmingly honest British atheist philosopher. But I think I've met him once. It does seem to me to be precisely disarming in that way. But he says, quite extraordinarily, atheism and humanism, the claim that atheism and humanism seem to be conjoined is entirely wrong. He says when there are odds, a type of atheism that refused to revere humanity would be a genuine advance. So you have, I'm not sure then how he would then construct his morality, but I mean, it's interesting that even as it were within the enemy camp, you might say, there's real difficulty in answering that question about where values are to be derived, from where values are to be derived.
Yeah, I mean, there really are. I mean, there are lots of different things going on there. The first, really important to make a point about humanism, it's basically a Christian offshoot. Humanism, as we understand it in the West today, developed from what were known as ethical unions in Britain from the 1890s onwards. These were basically churches for people who had lost their faith but wanted to retain some form of morality and community. And over the period of the 20th century, they kind of died away, but the secular humanist movements developed from them. So they're kind of like, people have called them slightly provocatively, a kind of long-term Christian heresy. Commitments of humanism, I mean, it depends what they are, but it's a commitment to human dignity, human equality, free will, rationality, creativity, those kind of things. They find a very comfortable home in the Christian worldview because they kind of make sense, as Rupert said, they kind of make sense given the framework that we operate in. Nonetheless, I think it is fair to say that you can draw some concepts of right and wrong behavior and good and evil from what Christians would call natural law, from the world around it. There's no kind of deep necessity to it, but I don't want to lead people to suggest that either only Christians can be moral, that transparently isn't the case, or that the, as it were, raw materials of a worldview, of a moral worldview aren't already there. I think they are. It's just giving them any form and deep content is very hard in a solely materialistic worldview.
Rupert, I was very struck that by a quotation that you put in near this beginning of the second chapter from Lucy Beckett, and you said, "From the cradle to the grave, in virtue, in brains, in looks, in health and in strength, in evenness of temper, in kindness and patience. In short, in value to others," talking about people, "they are far from equal. Only in the eyes of God are they equal. The statement that all are equal is meaningless unless it is given meaning by belief in the existence of God and belief that all human beings are created in the divine image." But do you think that's an exclusive claim? Could Muslims or people following the Jewish faith make that same claim, and you would accept that?
Well, I think the open-handedness of our vision has already been signposted by Nick. If we're all made in the image of God, then it follows that an atheist, a humanist, an adherent of another faith is perfectly capable of leading a moral life. I mean, sometimes in atheist polemic, you get this claim that Christians are saying that only a believer in God can be a good person. You know, everyone else is going to fry in hell. Nothing could be further from the truth, really. Classically, conscience was seen as the exercise of reasoned judgment. The early Christians, I think, were perfectly clear that Plato and Aristotle and others had led good lives. The claim of Christianity is not see it our way or face the fires of hell. It's more that this, we believe, is the richest account of the truth of our being, and therefore Christians can be led by the light of, if you will, full sunlight, whereas others, pre-Christian pagans, others today not in the Christian fold, can be led by the light of the moon and the stars.
There are
Jews.
doubtless there'll be Rupert, there'll be conservative evangelicals listening to you, ready to quote the phrase "No man cometh to the Father but by me," and who do say and who do believe that Christianity makes an exclusive claim.
Well, that needs unpacking, Roger. It's precisely that verse which is sometimes seen as the proof text of exclusivist Christians. John 14:6, I am the way and the truth and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. That's precisely a verse I would invoke in support of my own argument. The crucial question is, whom does the me in that verse refer to? And I would say, quite clearly, referring back to the prologue of John's Gospel, it refers to the Word of God, the Logos, which, as John makes perfectly clear, enlightens the hearts of all people. Don't forget also that Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus at the Transfiguration. According to the encounter between Jesus and the scribe, described in Mark 12, the scribe is told that he is very close to the kingdom of God because he said that the law can be summed up by the two supreme commandments of love of God and neighbour. Don't forget also that the church, or at least the classical Christian traditions, have a feast day in honour of the Holy Innocents, the 28th of December. Now, this is a group of people, babies slaughtered by Herod. They weren't Christians and they had never heard of Christ. So I would not be too anxious myself about, let's say, the operations of the Holy Spirit outside the ranks of the visible church. I would leave that to the grace of God.
Now, could I come back to Nick? Non-believers would be think I was being remiss if I didn't put a charge sheet against you for the crimes of Christianity or rather institutional Christianity over the last 2,000 years. And we could go through them. There's one indubitably true, which is anti-Semitism, which the Christian church bears a great responsibility for. And as you know better than I, Protestants can't escape either if they read the later works of Martin Luther. So I suppose the immediate question there is, can you make this separation between, if you like, the Christian faith and the way in which institutions which promulgate it have behaved?
So two things to say to that. The first is absolutely. I mean, there is no attenuating, no denying the crimes committed not just by Christians, but for ostensibly theological reasons. And anti-Semitism is the longest running sore of that over a very long period of time. I think it would be a Christian duty, frankly, to admit to everything on that charge sheet. The second point is that doesn't change the first point I was making, just because, Luther wrote poisonously anti-Semitic tracts, just because there were Christians in the 18th century who justified the transatlantic slave trade on explicitly theological grounds. We remember Wilberforce and and the abolitionists rightly, and they won through in the end, and they won through for good theological reasons. But one of the reasons they had to argue theologically was because there were some Christians who took texts primarily from the Old Testament, very occasionally from the New, to justify slavery and to justify the slave trade. There is no hiding that, and it absolutely has to be out there. But that doesn't change the fact, to take that particular example, that Wilberforce et al. Did argue powerfully and consistently and tenaciously against the slave trade on theological grounds, because Christianity has been the water in which Western intellectual and social and political life has swum for a good 1,500 years. You are going to find it used and abused in some very different ways.
Well, yes, but I mean, a fair amount of abuse. I could have talked about the treatment of women, which in many ways continues the present day. I could talk about the treatment of homosexuals. You could talk about a raft of things like that, not to mention the Crusades and other things. And also this, in some people's view, fatal deal, if you like, between what is happening now in Russia, between the churches and the state in order to preserve the church. But what preserve the church? What for? In other words, Christians have far too frequently identified with the existing power structures in order to preserve themselves. But I mean, we could go on and on about that. But I wanted to raise the question about science and religion, because there has been, if you talk to a non-believer, an atheist and so on, there's this still in the heart of what they feel is that Christianity has very slow, shall we say, if not in opposition to the development of science and scientific knowledge. When you get that argument put to you, what do you say?
So my first answer is absolute cobblers. Sorry, it's absolutely nonsense. It really is. I've been doing a lot of work on science religion over the years. There is no accident that science, as we now know it, as it was known at the time, experimental natural philosophy, grew up in Western Europe. It did so for some pretty deep theological reasons. I could bore you to sleep on them, but just two very brief ones. One, science depends on the idea that creation is lawful, and that was drawn from a theological worldview. Secondly, science, in the 17th century sense of the word, depended on the experiment. The experiment derived from ideas of experience, and that was derived from ideas that human mind is fallen. We can't simply think our way to the truth. We have to feel our way to the truth. We have to experience our way to the truth. People talked about experiments a lot of the time in the 17th century. It was usually in the form of experimental prayer. That was how the word was often used. It was these themes, lawfulness and experimentation, that came in along with other themes to give birth to modern science. The idea that
are you saying in a sense, sorry to interrupt, are you saying in a sense that the Enlightenment was as much a return to the Christian faith or a development of the Christian faith rather than in opposition to it?
So, sorry to complexify things, there was no such thing as the Enlightenment. Historians increasingly recognizing that there were various different things that were going on in the 18th century. One of them, a relatively small one, in France, pretty anti-Christian, but Scottish Enlightenment, English Enlightenment, so on and so forth, much more pro-Christian. And this was the period of time, particularly 1700 to about 1760, when there are innumerable books published in English arguing for the existence of God and the understanding of his attributes from the natural world, from science. Ironically, this was a period of considerable harmony between science and religion. The idea that the Enlightenment was this vigorously anti-Christian movement derives basically from a handful of French philosophers in the late 18th century.
So just to summarize at the end of this discussion, you're saying essentially that scientific progress is things like equality before the law, human rights, are in large part the product of Christianity.
I'm saying they owe an awful lot to Christianity, but I would always introduce the caveat that doesn't mean there weren't other influences, because there were. And secondly, it doesn't mean that all Christians were always necessarily in support of these developments, because in some measures, in France in the 18th century and in different ways after the Darwinian Revolution in Britain in the 19th century, there was Christian opposition. So it's a complex story, but ultimately, I would say that so many of these roots did find nourishment in Christian soil.
Well, we'll just have to take a quick break there. Thank you very much. We'll return in a moment, but please do tell us what you think. You can email us on unbelievable@premier.org.uk, and we do want to hear your thoughts, so please do keep in touch. We'll be back in just a moment.
Historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's an incredible evidence.
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
Not just
so?
that. Not just that. Where was the expectation of a Messiah rising again from the dead? Tell me that.
How many ancient Christian writings do we have by somebody who says in those writings that he saw Jesus? No.
No, this is my turn.
Let me finish.
Let me finish my point.
I'm answering your question.
You weren't answering the question.
You asked me my question,
Okay.
and
I'll
I'm
let you
answering
finish.
it.
All right,
Let's let Bout finish.
That was the exciting part when we arm wrestle.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Unbelievable podcast. Today, Nick Spencer and Rupert Shortt are talking to us. We've been talking to Nick about his book, The Evolution of the West, and the central role of Christianity in that. I want to start off this second section of the podcast talking about Rupert's book, which has just come out, The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. Now, Rupert, as I think you made clear at the beginning of our discussion, the eclipse of Christianity in the West, we can't obviously make that case in terms of Africa, but in terms of the eclipse in the West, how much of an eclipse is it?
Well, in some ways, very, very deep. I live in London, but I've got country roots, and as part of my researches, I attended rural churches that are really hanging on by their fingertips. And more than once, the comment was made to me, the church is dying on its feet. I think similar things could be said of France, of Germany, and of other European societies, even the United States, which is often thought to be a kind of firewall against the secularization narrative, is nevertheless experiencing quite strong falls in church attendance, or has done since the turn of the millennium. But as I've already hinted, we need to be a little bit careful, because there are green shoots as well as wintry landscapes, and a city like London, but not only London, but many other cities in the UK, have become considerably godlier places since the year 2000 because of immigration, and church going in London has gone up markedly.
I mean, you've given up some in your book, at the beginning of your book, you give some statistics about the decline in, certain church attendance. You say, and you say you quote in particular a book by Clive Field of the University of Birmingham. You call his book indispensable. It's called Counting Religion in Britain, 1970 to 2020. And he says in 1924, 3.5 million people were registered on the Church of England electoral rolls. There were only 900,000 by 2019. Catholic candidates for confirmation fell from 72,000 in 1971 to 24,000 in 2019. But you also pick up something which is, I think, very intriguing. Of those who ticked the no religion box, only half said they didn't believe in God at all, and a fifth of non-believers expressed confidence in some form of afterlife. So what that seems to indicate is there's an appetite which perhaps isn't being fully satisfied.
That's right. And if you talk to clergy being interviewed about their experience, for example, of preparing people for funerals, you will hear the comment being made again and again that the views are hazy, they're not really very well thought out, but it would be a mistake to say that they represent a complete repudiation of the spiritual dimension. Again and again, I've detected a cleavage between the opinion forming class and ordinary people on the ground. And I mean, I spent much of my life working on Fleet Street, as you've indicated, and now I work in a university. But I do have connections with different kinds of demographic. Indeed, one of the benefits of going to church, I think, is that it can bring you into contact with a much more socially diverse group of people. And I think part of the problem may lie inside the church, a sort of lack of confidence with respect to proclamation, timidity. There are lots of currents in play here.
But I think if you look, what I seem to get you off from the book is the suggestion that the appetite and the need is undiminished. But whereas in the past you could rely upon schools and to give people a basic, if not a basic grounding, a basic awareness of a raft of things that they could then turn to later in life, reflect upon, develop, and so on. If they don't have that basic grounding, they have the desire, but they're lost. Is that?
Absolutely. I mean, Chesterton said long ago, didn't he, when people give up on a faith like Christianity, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything. And as Tom Wright, the New Testament scholar, has pointed out, Mars, the god of war, and Mammon, the god of money, and Aphrodite, goddess of erotic love, are now worshipped in fresh guises. It is a melancholy fact that younger people seem remarkably unfamiliar with the rhythms of the church year, for example, with biblical stories. Even Richard Dawkins, you probably know, has lamented levels of biblical illiteracy among the young. People I interviewed teaching English literature courses had to do remedial work because of the number of Shakespeare plays or Jane Austen novels or whatever it might be which refer to the Bible, and this might as well be a foreign language to a lot of young people. And I don't want to sound too much like a grumpy old man, but we're very good at affirming other traditions in a country like the UK, which is to our credit. Please don't get me wrong, but it wouldn't do us any harm, I think, to also be proud of our own traditions. Easter is about a little bit more than the Easter Bunny, and
can I pick up with
Christmas
Nick?
Likewise.
Sorry, beg your pardon. Nick, can I pick up on this? Because this is very strange. I mean, I hope what we'll be able to do in the next few minutes is also examine some of the reasons why this may have occurred. But I mean, it's in purely educational terms. How can you expect people to understand why this country is constituted as it is, understand or appreciate our literature, or indeed Western literature as a whole, or Western art, or music, or whatever, if you don't understand, have a basic grasp of Christianity? I mean, it's an essential key, whether you wish to believe it or not. Knowing about it is an essential key to so much of our culture. And yet here we are, allowing, almost throwing that key away. Why do you think, Nick, this has come about?
It's such a good question. I mean, I read literature and history at university a long time ago. I wasn't a Christian when I came up. And I remember the first tutorial I had with the medieval tutor, and he said, you've got to realise that reading medieval literature without knowing the Bible is like studying mathematics without being able to count to 10. And I thought at the time, God, steady on. I mean, that's a bit strong, isn't it? But you know, he's kind of right. And there was this story recently, wasn't there, about, I think it was Nottingham University issuing their English literature students with a, what do they call it, a warning, a trigger warning. About studying the Canterbury Tales because it had scenes of Christianity in it or something like that. I mean, it's partly a kind of just a cultural amnesia. And a kind of a neophilia. We love that which is new. We're progressive. We want to move on. That which is old is less important. Some people would say, perhaps slightly more conspiracy-minded people would say, actually, it's deliberate. It is, as an aside, it's really interesting how in the popular mind, when they have this kind of war between science and religion, which, as we talked about earlier, really wasn't a war, but in the popular mind, they say it's kind of biology or cosmology, which is the big enemy of science. Absolutely not. I mean, it really hasn't. If any kind of scientific discipline has had a war against religion, it's been sociology.
So what are you suggesting in a way that there is still a mindset among, well, who should we say, teachers or whatever, that still that old belief that religion and science are in opposition and that science, as it were, trumps, has done away with the need for religion? Or I just see. I don't want to get into the sort of culture wars, which I think is terribly dangerous and indeed has been politicized. But to try and just hold on to this basic fact that to understand who we are and to appreciate our culture, and knowledge and understanding of Christianity is an essential element. The idea now, why I still can't understand why we've let a situation develop when that isn't not the case, and we are producing a generation of people who I don't think, from my own experience, have less of a longing for spiritual matters, but don't have a guide, don't have a map anymore.
Well, I mean, as I was saying, I think there are basically three reasons here. One is that there is this; it's a passive reason, a neophilia, a kind of desire for the new, just passively forgetting the old. Secondly, for some people, it is ideological. I don't, like you, want to get into a cultural thing, but it is nonetheless the case for some people, religion is wrong, it is the enemy, it is reactionary, and it is better if we stand away from it. And the third point was the one that Rupert made, is that actually we have a very hospitable and open culture, which has meant, quite rightly, learning about and recognizing and celebrating other cultural elements. And that has sometimes come with a nervousness about doing that about our own. And I think those three things have combined so that actually Christianity has culturally slid off towards the periphery.
Could I just pick up that point? Because is it related to multiculturalism in this sense that, as a lot of us understood multiculturalism, is a corrective to a sort of ignorance or sense of superiority, that we ought to learn and be open to other cultures and appreciate what's best in them. But the danger of that is that you undervalue your own culture and you need to reassert the values of your own culture. And indeed, you can make a case that it's only in a form of liberal democracy that it's possible for a range of cultures to prosper. But for some reason, multiculturalism in some people's minds has meant playing down the virtues and values of, if you like, Christian culture, because it thought it might in some ways diminish other cultures. Now, does that have any resonance with you?
Absolutely. I think, if you'll forgive me, we do need, at least in passing, to reference the culture wars. The late Roger Scruton, the great conservative philosopher, coined the term oikophobia. That's to say the opposite of xenophobia. Oikophobia being a dislike or a suspicion of one's own home territory. And there can be a danger at present, I think, that we celebrate an inclusiveness that fails to include. There's a hierarchy of victimhood. There are certain identities that must be given priority, and the Christian comes fairly low down the pecking order. There's an assumption on the part of, I fear, rather sort of ignorant arbiters of culture that Christianity is a Western religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a religion of the global South. That it's a European and white religion. Again, totally false. It's an export from the Middle East. And also, equally questionably, that Christians are somehow privileged. Christianity,
or the assumption that Christians were in a sort, or sorry to interrupt, the assumptions in some way that Christians were in a majority and therefore didn't, if you like, need the protections that the so-called
that's right. Christianity, in truth, is not only the world's most persecuted religion numerically; it's more persecuted than all other faiths put together. It's frightfully fashionable to be a persecuted something else. It's not fashionable to be a persecuted Christian. You don't get radicalized young Christians hurling bombs at government buildings in let's say, communist or Muslim majority countries. And
although in the past, and should I reference in Bartholomew's massacre, there are plenty of Christians.
Yes, but let me speak to that. You raised an important point earlier, but we need to make a logical distinction here. Jesus was among the first to warn of wolves in sheep's clothing. A correct definition of a Christian is not a good person, actually. It's really important to emphasize this. The correct definition of a Christian is someone who acknowledges their failure to be good. So the real issue shadowing the whole of our conversation today is whether or not Christianity is true, because you can produce a list of social goods till the cows come home associated with Christianity. But at the end of the day, all the skeptic is likely to say is something like, well, thank you very much. Christianity is a useful fiction. Thank you, Christianity. You've raised us to the branches that we now perch on, but we can now proceed with with our own lights. So whether or not individual Christians have been violent and intolerant, that if and when they have, that is to be deplored, needless to say. But that is logically distinct from the question of whether Christianity is true or not, whether this worldview holds water. And that's why I devote a chunk of my book to just getting into basic questions about the existence of God and the historical foundations of the Gospels and the resurrection and so forth.
Nick, you wanted to come in at this point.
Well, yes. I mean, it wasn't to that point. It was a slightly earlier point about the culture of the sort of centrality of Christianity to British culture. There's one other point that's worth making, which is that up until middle of the 20th century, British culture was, historically speaking, really quite remarkably homogeneous and settled. We hadn't undergone the tremendous political upheavals that many European countries had done in the 19th and late 18th century. We hadn't had one of those for 350 years. There have been plenty of tensions, of course. The first half of the 19th century was very, very violent. There were intra-religious tensions between chapel and church, for example, and so on and so forth. But the point I'm making is that the Christianity of national culture was basically assumed and had been assumed for a very long time. And so when it got to the later years of the 20th century, and you could no longer so comfortably assume it, people weren't used to having to articulate it, to have to define and defend it. And I think that's one of the other reasons why it's kind of slid to the periphery, because it was at the centre, it occupied the centre. People just assumed that it occupied the centre. So when it no longer did, people weren't equipped to articulate why it should.
Well, Nick Spencer and Rupert Shortt, thanks for the moment. We're going to take another quick break. We'll come back to that thought in just a moment. And if you are enjoying today's conversation, do hit the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or follow us if you're tuning in on a podcast, so as not to miss more debates and discussions like this. We'll be back in a moment for our final segment. You're listening to me, Roger Bolton, and my guests are Nick Spencer and Rupert Shortt. Please join us again in a moment.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online, so thanks again.
Well, welcome back to the final part of today's podcast, where I'm joined by writer and academic Nick Spencer, author of many books, including The Evolution of the West, How Christianity Shaped Our Values, and by Rupert Shortt, whose new book is The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. We'll list both their books in the show notes. In this final section, I just want to spend a little time on, again, developing the thoughts about why we're in the situation we're in, and then looking towards the end of the discussion for ways forward. And I'd like to come to you, Rupert Shortt, if I may. Towards the end of your book, you look at the lack of confidence, to put it very politely, that some of Britain's major cultural institutions have in the validity of an interest by people in matters of faith. You're particularly I won't say critical of the BBC, because I think what you say is simply accurate. But what you trace is, and I had personal experience of, an unawareness of the importance of faith and a lack of confidence in an audience's interest in it, and a failure to understand the creative opportunities which are involved, which occasionally you glimpse when things get through. But we seem to have a hierarchy at the top of some of our cultural institutions who do not believe that religion in its broader sense is an area worth exploring in their media. Now, why do you think we've arrived at this? Is it one used to say it's a generational thing, a particularly 60s grouping of people coming through, but this is continuing. Why?
Yes, I mean, secular trends among opinion formers are particularly noteworthy. And, I'm sorry to say I am critical of the BBC, notwithstanding my enormous gratitude to much of the corporation's output. But there seems to be an assumption that although it's okay to give Christianity its niche slots, thought for the day, daily service, choral evensong, Sunday worship, that sort of thing, Christianity isn't allowed to enter into the broader cultural discussion. So, for example, a really crucial program like Start the Week on Radio 4 every Monday morning, which is a sort of shop window for the most important currents in the culture, significant books being published and so forth. It's a long time, I think, since Christianity has been given a serious hearing there. When other people working in other fields pronounce on religion, when a geneticist like Steve Jones writes a book about the Bible from a scientific perspective, the red carpet is rolled out for a figure like him. He was all over the BBC when his book The Serpent's Promise was published about 10 years ago, even though in my view it was theologically illiterate. But when the shoe is on the other foot, there doesn't seem to be nearly so much of an interest, and this relates, as we've been discussing, to the way that intellectuals and opinion formers tend to live in bubbles. They tend to be more left-wing and secular in outlook, and more out of touch with the mass of the population. And it's perhaps not uncoincidental that we're speaking very soon after Donald Trump's election victory, and the lessons, perhaps unpalatable lessons for many, that carries.
Nick, can I pick up with you on this point? I mean, I could buy the idea that a certain liberal sort of skepticism is the hallmark of many journalists, distrust of authority, etc., etc., etc. You can make all of that case. But one's also struck by, sometimes you find out there are a surprising number of Christians who work within the media, but they are very reluctant to identify, as if they, and I shouldn't put words, I don't know why they have, as if people will then say, oh, well, actually, in which case we can't trust you because you're committed on it, therefore you're not open-minded enough, etc., etc., or something. Now, is that something that rings a bell with you, that Christians who do exist in the media and elsewhere are nervous about advertising that fact?
Yes, it's a short answer for that. You occasionally kind of stumble across a Christian, I don't know, who might work for the Guard or something like that, and they say to you very sotto voce that they're actually a believer, just so that they're not outed. The question is why. I mean, you have had much more experience with the BBC than I have. I have to say my experience tends to be much more positive, and perhaps it's just those I have engaged with have a really positive and engaging attitude towards religion in general. But as I said, you have a much more a deeper experience than me. I think there's something actually quite deep going on here, which is worries about exclusivism. I think that's what it comes down to. An assumption that a secular worldview is necessarily universalist and inclusivist, and that's what we should be aiming for, and that religious worldviews are exclusivist and therefore alienate others and fragment the wider polity, and therefore we can't give them too much of a central position, because doing so would risk fragmentation, alienation and exclusion. And we've got to be absolutely honest here. I'm sure we have all met religious believers, or have certainly met Christians who are narrow-minded and exclusivist in quite an unpleasant way, and who, frankly, you wouldn't want anywhere near a BBC microphone. So there's fire beneath the smoke. But I think it's a myth to say this kind of liberal secular view is necessarily inclusive, because actually many people's experience of it is the opposite. And what it effectively does was bracket out people who don't hold that particular liberal secularist view. So the task is to have views that are comprehensive doctrines, the philosophers would say, comprehensive moral doctrines, ideological, but at the same time, their boundaries are permeable and they're open and they're inclusive.
Well, I'm interesting that you use that, because my childhood, I started off in the conservative evangelical branch of the Church of England. And I mean, on one hand, they were full of very good people who were concerned about the wider world, but there was that real sense in which you separate yourself off. And there's a danger of, if you like, the world is a dangerous place out there. Just keep it to a group of people and so on. And there is that tendency, I think, within Christianity. But going back to the question of the media as well, there are. Is it fair to say there are technical difficulties when you come to television? Because television loves crime stories. It loves visual sensation and so on. It finds it very difficult to create the space for silence, for thought, for radio perhaps can do it more. But when it occasionally does happen in television, it's immensely moving. So it may be true that it is, as it were, more easier to make a film about a crime than it is about somebody's belief and thoughts about things. But I can see all of this, but I'm still slightly baffled about this lack of confidence. Now, if not just in the broadcaster and not just in the BBC, but it's a lack of confidence which is there in government, it seems to me. If we look at the latest, I'm sorry, this perhaps people who are not in the UK, it's a bit narrow. But if you look at the latest Broadcasting Act that has finally gone through Parliament, what has happened in relation to public service broadcasters is that the specific mention of a number of things they should supply has been taken out. So there's now no reference to religion at all. Public service broadcasters have to do, there's a general phrase, but doesn't specify, to be fair, it doesn't specify science either. It does specify children. So religion isn't specified. At the same time, the regulator that is supposed to monitor how the public service broadcasters behave and how they implement the act has said that we don't want the power, and we can't afford anyway the time, to measure the output. So the output isn't specified as a public service necessity, and the regulator is not going to measure what is actually done. So if we're not careful, we won't know what we're missing. Now, that's gone through Parliament. So, Rupert, again, the broadcasters should be regulated, and that regulation in this area isn't happening. Why? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I can't really, being a politically homeless centrist, I can't really try to comment on what's been going on in the minds of the Conservative or the Labour governments. But I don't think
this was a thing which was can be related to a specific political party. It is just that there was a real opportunity in Parliament to say no. From people of all sides to say this is an essential part of public service broadcasting. And I know it was rushed through in the end, but basically they flunked it.
Yes, they did. And this, again, is it casts an important sidelight on our culture at the moment. I don't want to give the impression that my book is just one long cri de coeur. There are lots of signs of hope there. I found in the course of my researches, in fact, that the book was turning into as much of a celebration as a lament. As I went to one urban parish after another, for example, in deprived areas, and looked at the way that it again and again, it was the local parish priest or vicar who was the one of the principal forms of glue in a for an otherwise quite tattered social fabric. And then to speak to the specific question you raise, in the chapter on culture that you referenced, which talks a fair bit about the BBC, there's also a coda about a lovely organisation called The Pitch, which is an offshoot of the Bible Society, and they award grants to up-and-coming filmmakers making shorts. Short films are very, very crucial stepping stones for filmmakers who are wanting to catch the eyes of funders and graduate in due course to making full feature films. And the pitch has given money to one filmmaker after another who wants to produce a piece which is inspired by this or that biblical passage. And if you want proof positive of the extraordinary capacity of the Bible to speak to the present day, to nourish contemporary cultural conversation, memo to the BBC, it's there. If I could make one final point, Roger, I've just finished writing a review of Jordan Peterson's enormous new book, We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine, which is due to be published in mid-November. And I don't think that we should complete this conversation without registering some awareness of the fact that this extraordinary public intellectual, highly controversial, of course, reviled as much as he is loved, has given talks reaching audiences of millions about the early chapters of the Bible, displaying a verve and a fluency and a range of cultural reference that would put, in my view, most church leaders in the shade. So when all's said and done, and notwithstanding everything we've said in this conversation, there does seem to be an extraordinary hunger for Christianity in general and the Bible in particular among young people, particularly as it happens since the pandemic.
And Spencer, if one tries to be more optimistic, and maybe I am too much an old-time broadcaster or whatever, the same technology that can work for evil, which can allow people to spread disinformation and so on, the same technology can do the opposite. We now have, Christians now have the way, as it were, of going directly to people. They don't have to negotiate a relationship with a broadcaster anymore. Through podcasting and elsewhere, there can be that direct relationship. Now, the danger of that is that, it's a bit like silos. People who are interested find it, and people who don't think they should be interested or aren't don't. There's a danger there. But, I mean, do you have optimism that this eclipse of Christianity to which Rupert has referred, and the large-scale ignorance that you referred to about how Christianity shaped our values, give us some seeds of hope about the way in which we might be able to now rectify that? Please.
That's a tough. Roger, not even my best friends would call me hopeful. Okay, so you really set a tall order before me there. First of all, that point is really important. We're having this conversation on Unbelievable. We're having this conversation a week or so after people pointed out that one of Trump's media tactics was to go and speak on podcasts. So we are seeing, in a remarkably short period of time, an extraordinary fragmentation of media language. I take what the point you make about the broadcasting charter and the act and so on and so forth, but actually, that feels a bit 20th century. The 21st century seems much more of people doing the kind of thing that we're doing at the moment and listening to people doing the kind of thing that we're doing at the moment. Now, that's both good and bad. It's good because there's a direct sort of connection there. But as many people have pointed out, this was kind of what happened at the beginning of the 16th century. This is the only parallel time in modern history where you have a rapid disintegration of a media landscape. In that instance, caused by the arrival and distribution of the printing press. And that's one of the reasons, by no means the only one of the reasons why Europe degenerated into a century of conflict after that. Now, that's not a very helpful response, I'll grant you. But going back to an earlier point of the conversation, what we have seen is also a fragmentation of the spiritual landscape. And what we have seen, and Rupert talks about this in his book a bit as well, that it's lack of faith in the institutions, and that is such a crucial word, the institutions of religiosity that has gripped the Western world in the last 3 or 4 generations or so. It is not a complete abandonment of belief. T.S. Eliot once remarked in one of his essays that a culture has not ceased to be Christian unless and until it has fully become something else. And our culture has not become something else. We are living in an unstable and unusual plural culture at the moment where lots of different ideologies and beliefs and commitments are jostling with one another and finding kind of energy for that through this disintegrated media landscape. So basically, it's all to play for. We are living in a very unusual time. And I suspect if we have this conversation 30, 40, 50 years' time, we will look back and say, wow, I wasn't expecting that to happen.
And finally, with you, Rupert, all is not lost. There's much to play for. Do you think? I mean, I'm struck by the fact that, for example, in a lot of church schools, or not a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, some that I know of, the staff have lost confidence about teaching the faith, even though they're a church school. There are ways, in a sense, what it comes back to is doesn't it come back to a greater commitment and self-confidence on the behalf of Christians that they have a truth that they need to communicate and get out there and communicate?
Yes, absolutely. If I can do a shameless plug, this is the cover of my book, and why I display it like that is that when we were trying to agree on what the cover should display, I said a book carrying the title Eclipse ought to have an eclipse image on the cover. That makes sense to me. On the other hand, what does an image of the eclipse have to do with Christianity as such? And I got a message from a wise friend who said, but Rupert, the subtle and correct message conveyed by that cover, showing the sun, is that Christianity itself is the sun. And for all the reasons that we've spelt out, Christianity, we swim in Christian waters, whether we're aware of them or not. And I think that Christianity supplies the strongest philosophical underpinnings for getting us through the dilemmas that we now face, where there's so much cultural fragmentation. And if I may, I would just like to read a message I received from a clergyman during the course of my researches. And he says the following. He wanted to emphasize the extent to which his former pupils from Gen Z tend to campaign on specific issues rather than committing themselves to institutions. And he added, some of those issues, LGBT rights, safeguarding, for example, are ones on which the churches have questionable records. But rights-based campaigning tends towards factionalism and intolerance. The trans rights versus women's rights is an obvious example. At some point, he added, I hope, people will come to see the futility of this approach and be open to the attractions of the church, because at its best, it transcends differences of that kind. Quote, love, like death, hath all destroyed, rendered all distinctions void, names and sects and parties fall, thou, O Christ, art all in all, as Charles Wesley memorably put it.
Rupert Shortt, thank you very much. Rupert's the author of The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters, and I've also been talking to Nick Spencer, whose book, The Evolution of the West, How Christianity Has Shaped Our Values, is also available, both cracking reads. Thank you both very much for joining us, and thank you, our listeners, for listening to Well, hopefully it's not just long, but it's an interesting and thoughtful discussion. I learned a great deal for it, and we'll go back to both books. If you would like to learn more, you can contact us, and we'd like to hear from you. Our email is unbelievable@premier.org.uk, or on social media X @unbelievable, capital F, capital E, or on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok @Premier Unbelievable. For now, it's been a privilege to be with you, and we hope you'll come along next time for more discussions and debates. Goodbye.